Hi everybody. So today we're going to be talking about the ventricles of the brain. And so as you know, you have ventricles in your heart, and the ventricles in your heart are basically big chambers that fill up with blood and then pump the blood out. Well, the ventricles in your brain are kind of similar to the ones in your heart, but the difference is yes, these are openings, but these are going to produce a fluid called cerebrospinal fluid that's then going to go around throughout your central nervous system and deliver things and remove waste. So let's take a look first at cerebrospinal fluid. So we have cerebrospinal fluid. Okay, and again, your ventricles produce cerebrospinal fluid. We're going to talk about that in just a minute, but first let's talk about why you have cerebrospinal fluid. And cerebrospinal fluid is more commonly known as CSF. So there's a few different reasons why you have this. The first one is, and the main reason, is for protection of the brain. So you may have heard before that the brain actually sits in a fluid, and that acts as a shock absorber for it, and that's basically what the cerebrospinal fluid is. It is that fluid. So if I were to remove my brain, or an average brain, and hold it, it would weigh about 3 pounds. When the brain is sitting in the cerebrospinal fluid inside the skull, your brain actually weighs a lot less. If it was just in that fluid, it'd be about 1.5 pounds or 1.75 pounds. So you have protection from trauma and from blows and things such as that. The other thing we're going to look at is your cerebrospinal fluid circulates around the central nervous system. So when it does that, it provides nutrients, and it's also going to provide chemicals or ions, all right, such as sodium and potassium to the nervous system, okay? The other thing it's going to do is it will remove waste, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. We're going to talk about how nutrients and chemicals get into the cerebrospinal fluid in just a minute too. So if we look right here, this is to give you an idea of what we're looking at. This structure right here would be my ventricles, okay? And if you look right here, you can see it's blown up. So to give you an idea of what we're looking at, and the reason I drew this, is here you're looking at someone, imagine half my skull is gone and half my brain is gone, and now you're looking at me this way from the side. So let's go ahead and take a look at this. I'm gonna move my camera real fast. And I'm going to go like this. Okay. This is looking at it from the front. So this is looking from the side, and this is looking from the front. So this over here is as if you're looking at me like this. Take off half my skull, okay? So let's take a look at this real quick. Let me just move this back. And basically, you'll see this C-shaped structure. This C-shaped structure right here is called the lateral ventricle. Okay, now technically you have 2 lateral ventricles, okay? This is a lateral ventricle here, and this is a lateral ventricle here. So these are the lateral ventricles when you look at it from the front. Okay, so I got one that's over here, and one that's right there, okay? Now, if we look, you can see I drew it looks like a tube right there, a structure. This isn't really a tube, it's what we call a foramen. And a foramen is a hole. An anatomy foramen means a hole. So this is called our interventricular foramen. Okay? If we look over here, again, we have our 2 lateral ventricles. Right here is my interventricular foramen. So you can see it's between the ventricles, okay? So we have the interventricular foramen. Okay, and that's going to be the structure here, and this structure right here. Okay, these openings right here is what we're talking about, okay? Now, if we look, you can see right here, you see this thing that looks almost like a bird's head there? This structure is going to be called our 3rd ventricle. Now, you may be saying, well, why do you call it the 3rd ventricle? Where's ventricle number 1 and 2, or the 1st and 2nd ventricle? That's your lateral ventricles, okay? This big part right in here is my 3rd ventricle. Okay, so that's going to be my 3rd ventricle. Now, if you notice this bird's neck right here, this is going to be called my mesencephalic aqueduct. Okay, that's the mesencephalic aqueduct. It's the bird's neck. And it actually comes down into here too. Okay? So if we look at it right here, I kind of drew it smaller, but this is my mesencephalic aqueduct. Okay? And then if we look down in here, after the mesencephalic aqueduct, what's going to happen is my cerebrospinal fluid, or I have actually my fourth ventricle, which is going to be right here. So this is my fourth ventricle. And then this diamond-shaped thing here, let me make this a little more even. This right here is my fourth ventricle. Now the fourth ventricle is going to go down and it's going to drain into the central canal of the spinal cord. Okay, so this right here is going to be the central canal of my spinal cord, and it would also be this part that's down here. Okay, and again, this is looking from the front, this is looking from the side. So there's the parts of our ventricles, or there's our ventricles. So now, lining the ventricles, you have a network of capillaries, and this network of capillaries is going to be found on the floor of the lateral ventricle. All right, and I'm just drawing these right here. They're going to go all the way down, but I'm just drawing these right here. So we have these capillaries here. They're found on the floor of the lateral ventricle, on the roof of the third ventricle, and on the roof of my fourth ventricle. Okay, those are capillaries. All right, so these are going to be capillaries. All right, it's a network of capillaries. And then what's going to happen is you, on top of these capillaries, or surrounding these capillaries, going all the way around them, you're going to have large cells on here. And this goes throughout this whole thing. Okay, and again, I'm just drawing it on one side. It actually surrounds all these capillaries. And these are called appendable cells. All right, so these are going to be called appendable cells. And my appendable cells are going to produce cerebrospinal fluid. The appendable cells with the capillaries are going to be called my choroid plexus. That's my choroid plexus. So now my choroid plexus is made up of capillaries and appendable cells. So remember over there when we were talking about the nutrients getting into the cerebrospinal fluid and ions, and one other thing I forgot to mention is neurotransmitters. They're going to come from these capillaries and go into these appendable cells. The appendable cells are going to release the cerebrospinal fluid, right? And then that's going to make its way around the central nervous system. Okay, so now, how does it travel? So let's say we made our cerebrospinal fluid here in the lateral ventricles. It would then go into the third ventricle. From the third ventricle, it's going to go into the fourth, it's going to go through the mesencephalic aqueduct, into the fourth ventricle, down into the spinal cord, and we'll talk about what happens from there in a minute. If you make it in the third ventricle, it does not go into the lateral ventricles. What's going to happen is it kind of just drains down here. If you made it in the fourth ventricle, it's just going to drain down. So it doesn't go back up. I guess it could, but it doesn't really need to, okay? So basically, that's the function, or how it flows and how cerebrospinal fluid gets into these ventricles. So let's take a look now, because we talked about waste, and we got to get rid of this at some point. So let's go over here and just move my camera a little bit more. And what you're looking at here again is you're looking at the brain on someone facing that way, okay? Here, you can see my lateral ventricles there, my third ventricle, interventricular foramen, my mesencephalic duct. This down in here is going to be the central canal in my spinal cord. So when it comes to waste, let's look at this. you make about 500 milliliters of CSF per day, okay? At any given time in the body, you have about 150 milliliters of CSF. Okay, so you can see you're making more than what you actually use, so we have to get rid of this. In fact, you replace all of your CSF or your cerebrospinal fluid about every 8 to 10 hours. So let's take a look now, because we were talking over here about how this flows. So now we said it's going to go, let's say it goes from my lateral ventricle here, it went into my interventricular foramen, through my third ventricle, mesencephalic duct. I don't have my fourth ventricle drawn there, but through the fourth ventricle, into the central canal, and then it's going to make its way down the central canal. Now it can come out in different areas. I'm just going to have it coming down the bottom. So when it gets to the bottom of the spinal cord, it's going to come out and it's going to go into this blue area here, which is called our subarachnoid space. So when you see those blue lines, that's my subarachnoid space. Now, it's going to make its way back up towards the skull. In the skull, you can see we have a few different structures here. And the first one I have is this light brown one. I'm going to call this my inner dura mater. Okay? And then you see we have this dark blue one here. We're going to call this my outer dura mater. Okay, that's going to be my outer dura mater. And if you notice now, we have this space that's between here. So what's that space called? That space is known as my superior sagittal sinus. And in the superior sagittal sinus, we have blood vessels. So now my cerebrospinal fluid is going to make its way up. And up in here, you actually have openings in here in which the arachnoid sticks into the superior sagittal sinus. So it looks something like this. Okay, it's going to look something like this. And we call these, I'm going to make them dark just so we can see them better. We're going to call these our arachnoid granulations. Okay, and they're just the pieces that stick up. So what's going to happen now is when my cerebrospinal fluid comes up, it's going to go into this arachnoid granulation and into the superior sagittal sinus. And then what's going to happen is it's going to enter the bloodstream. And from the bloodstream, then it will be eliminated into the body. So that gives you an idea about the ventricles that are in the brain and cerebrospinal fluid and how it flows through the body. So thank you so much for watching.